We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for coming to the, I think this is the back 40. This may be the back 39 and a half. The Nelson room, I think, is the back 40. But anyway, thanks for coming out on Friday afternoon. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about how to use the classroom response system that I got with a MACUL grant with my students. Now, I teach at Spring Arbor University, and Spring Arbor University is Jackson County, okay, right about there. And I teach in the School of Education, so we do pre-service education. We have probably about 500 in our program, teacher prep. And then we've got a graduate program with maybe about 100 full-time, and then at least as long as the 18-hour program lives, we've probably got another a few more hundred that take the 18-hour program. And once that dies, then who knows what we'll have. We'll have something different. But what I'm going to be doing is talking about my work with undergraduate students. So these are students that are, in this particular class, they're sophomores. And I teach a science class, and it's science content for elementary teachers. So I don't do methods. And I say that right away many times the first few days of class. This is not a methods class. We're doing science content because the state has standards, as you probably know, for understanding science content. And so we have a separate methods class, and they do the science methods. So I do the science content, they do the science methods. I also teach an ed tech class, and that is for both elementary and secondary. And in that class, we work with the classroom response system also. They're not so much the students as they are the teachers. So we have a little system going where whenever we have a class discussion or a lecture of some sort, we assign or have actually volunteers from the class, maybe 2 at a time per day. And what they do is they go and create questions for using Marzano's levels for the next class session, and then we just quiz each other on that. And one of the things that I really like about both of these is they're simple. The Turning Technologies software is one of many clicker software or clicker devices. This particular one is not used with open-ended questions. So that's what the clickers look like up there, and you basically have a multiple choice, and then they put in a response based on whatever choice they want. And then there's a radio frequency receiver, and that plugs into your laptop through USB. What's nice about radio frequency is then you're not too worried about having to point at something. It's just as long as you're in the vicinity, it'll collect the response. And the clickers themselves have a little green light, so when you click your response, there's a little green light that shows up, and that's how the student knows that something just happened. And then when it tallies it up, there's a little tally running total of all the responses collected. And so the student can look at the green light and look at the number increment and know that they probably got recorded. Usually when we do class, I count how many people we've got that day, and that's the number I'm looking for in the responses. So if somebody's waiting, I'll know if somebody hasn't come in yet. I don't want to cut them off because they might just be thinking about it a little more deeply. So that's basically the approach that we're going to use. I'm also using something else, and that is something called Splashtop Streamer, and that is to turn your iPad and your computer working together into sort of a low-cost interactive whiteboard. And I'm still kind of playing around with it. I was telling some of the people who heard earlier, one of the problems is the controls for the annotation and for the keyboard for the interactive whiteboard software are pretty much right on top of the advance to the next frame for Prezi. So I have to use my pinky, I think, and be careful. So if I have an accident or two, but what happens if I hit the annotation control, I can annotate up on the screen. You can see the tools I have up there, and then I can just do the normal sort of annotation stuff. This is different than maybe a Promethean or a Smartboard or some of the other ones, or even the portable solutions, because at least as far as I can tell, I can't. There's not a way to really save unless I do an actual screen capture. There's not a way to save the annotation. So if I go out of annotation mode, then I lose all of the annotations I made. So what I try to do to compensate for that is I just have a screencast program running. It's capturing right now, in fact, and that runs, and that will capture everything. So that's pretty much what I do. And then just to make it really complicated, I'm also recording myself with my iPod Touch, because that way I can lay the audio in with that and create a little video. So that's what I'm hoping to do when it's all said and done. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So pinky.
You ever tried air sketch?
I have not tried AirSketch. We're trying to standardize on something, and so that's why we picked this. No, I actually saw AirSketch after we made this decision. Have you used it? Mm-hmm. What do you think of it?
I like it a lot.
Do you?
And you can save the annotation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to take a look at that. This one, we jumped on this like in maybe, well, the summer of 11 is probably when they had a kind of a palatable version out. November of 11 is probably when they had something that I thought I could actually use. But it's still kind of being produced, and they still take feedback. So how long has AirSketch been around?
I don't know, really, honestly. I've been using it for 6 months.
Okay. They must have all hit the market similarly, huh? Doesn't record voice. Okay. Well, that's good to know. This Prezi you can get to from my Weebly site, and if you go to the MACUL conference site, you can get to it. But just in case, it's also at that location. Actually, the MACUL conference site points to that. And in case you didn't know that, you can get all the speaker handouts from that location. If you go to macul.org and then go to conferences and then 2012 MACUL conferences and speaker handouts, you can get everybody's. And even if you go right now and look, there'll be more stuff that's going to get added later and later. So, and it's both handouts and links to people's websites. So it's not just me there; it's everybody else. Pinky. Oh, see, I got the keyboard just now. That's funny. There we go. Okay, so philosophically, just want to kind of set the stage here. Some decisions that we made beforehand, and that is, and I'm really trying to focus on the pedagogy here and not so much on the technology. That's why I almost brought the clickers here and thought, well, then we'll start playing with them and then we won't get to this. So, so I didn't do that. But one of the decisions I wanted to kind of emphasize was whether to use this graded or ungraded. In other words, if I'm using this for formative assessment, am I going to also grade every single thing that the students do? So if I ask some clicker questions during the day, am I going to do that? And there are some places where that is the philosophy. I wanted to see if ungraded, that I would still get good enough responses and good enough idea of what they're learning that I could predict their grades, or at least correlate with their grades, and then have a sense that they're either understanding or not, and then I could do an intervention if I'm seeing them not learning. I know the pushback philosophy on that would be, well, if you don't grade it, they're not going to take it seriously. So far, I haven't had that problem. Now, I know I work with college sophomores, and they're not really a whole lot more mature than K-12 people. Apologies to anybody who's a recent graduate. But so they seem to take it pretty seriously as long as I don't have goofy options. So sometimes when I have a question with goofy options, then they'll take the goofy option. But if I have serious options, they generally, and I've always put something about I don't know or I'm not sure, if I give them kind of an out that way, they seem to always take it pretty seriously. So I haven't really had any issues with that. The next decision was whether to present the question straight through with explanations. And I'm going to talk about doing it both ways and the results I got doing it both ways. Now, by straight through, what I would mean is, say you're going to ask a series of questions, you would just go from question to question without commenting on right or wrong. Wow, that's a lot of people that said that. Nothing like that. You just kind of go from question to question. And then at the end, after you've gone through the sequence, then you might go back and revisit some of the questions. Well, I noticed, 5 of you said this and 10 of you said that, but really the 5 are right. That sort of thing happens at the end. With explanations would be the opposite, where you'd ask a question, you'd look at the result, and then talk about the question, see if they understand what's going on, and then move to the next question, do the same thing, then move to the next question. Okay? So that's when I talk about straight through, you just present the questions and then do any explaining on the back end. With explanations mean you put the explanations embedded in between the questions. The next decision we had to make was on the technology, and part of this was dictated, and I talked to a few of you beforehand, that the reason I went with Turning is because that's our school had already purchased a couple of sets to make available to faculty and students. And so I thought, well, I liked some of the software that gave me the ability to ask open-ended questions. I really like open-ended questions, even though I hate grading open-ended questions, but I like working with them. But on the other hand, part of my goal was to make something that the students could use either in methods classes, student teaching, or preparing them to be a teacher. And I thought, well, if I can give them some experience, then I'd rather do that. So I'll sacrifice the open-endedness of some of the other systems, go with the Turning, the simple clickers from Turning, and know that they'll be able to use those, and they can check a set out and use it either in their methods class or in student teaching, or even I give them the Rubio guarantee. When you graduate and you need some help, I'll be here to help you. And if that means loaning you my set, I'll loan you my set. So that's why on the technology I went with the simple clickers, which means they're basically just alphanumeric. One, you click an A or a 1, and that's it, or 2 or B, 3 or C, etc., all the way up to 9. And that's pretty much it for your options. There's no open-ended questions or answers on there. The other technological issue, not really an issue, but decision that I made early on was to make a permanent assignment to the students. And that is what I did when you set these up, and I know some people will just do the poll. Like a lot of the stuff that they talk about here, when they use something like some of the Web 2.0 polling software, the problem is you can't tie that back to who said it. And there's some reasons to do that, and sometimes I have anonymous polls, and they're really good, and you want to get someone's opinion without them worrying about what's going to happen. But really the best way to do this is to set up a participant list, and that's what Turning calls it. And basically it's just a very simple catalog where you assign one clicker to one student, and the clickers themselves have a barcode and then a hexadecimal number, about a 6-digit hexadecimal number on it. Now that hexadecimal number is very arcane. It could be something like 301F6C. I don't want students to have to remember 301F6C, so I just took a Sharpie and just numbered my clickers 1 through 25. And so then they're number 25, and I just tell them, just write it on your hand or someplace that's you're not going to clean up very easily. Somewhere write down what your number is, and then if they forget, I can always tell them too. But I make a permanent assignment so that each time I use the clickers, I get that participant list and activate it. Okay, so I never really do any polling just out there on the open, what the heck. Now, like I said, I can set up the poll so that I can make it an anonymous poll if I think that I want to give them that freedom, when I ask just pure opinion about something. And sometimes that happens. So a Sharpie is probably also a good thing to have. And then sometimes I'll ask a student to renumber them just to make it easy to find. But that's worked out pretty well. So then I can deal with the hexadecimal 6-digit number, and they can deal with the nice Arabic Sharpie number, and we're good. The final thing is I'm going to talk about some analysis tools. And so these are some of the things I'm going to look at. We're going to look at means and correlations and scatter plots and regressions. So if that, I'm going to try to make it as approachable as possible. But I think these are all really good tools to be able to use to be able to decide, make these decisions, whether I'm getting responses from my students. Is this something that I can trust to really make a decision about intervention before we get to a point where we're getting grades and it might be too late? So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what the capability of the software is to do that analysis. Okay, any questions about any of that so far? It's all preliminary. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, recently we had a discussion about the multiple choice format, and I don't know as an answer. Generally, do you put that in? Because we were talking like giving a pretest, doing the pretest, because generally speaking, we didn't have that. Some of the teachers said, well, you get better data if you include that, because they truly don't know, and then you can look for the improvement.
Yes, I'd say, unless you're pretty sure, I'd say I don't know is not a bad one to put in there. I like the idea of putting it in there. Now, it depends on the question. Sometimes I don't, sometimes I do.
Right.
But in fact, some of the questions I'm going to show you later, I probably don't have an I don't know in there. Yeah. But there's always a reason for that. Especially if you're going over new material, like you said, a pretest, I think I don't know is crucial. The way I do this is we give the information here, and then we do the questions either at the end of the day or the start of the next day. So they've already had a chance to cut through it. In that case, I may be more willing to see what their intuition says rather than give them an I don't know. So I'd say I don't know is great if it's truly a pre-assessment.
Like science content.
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Yeah, if they're seeing it for the first time, I would definitely do an I don't know. Absolutely. Okay. Or if it's an opinion, I would definitely do an I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Okay, good, thanks. Anybody else? Okay. Pinky, there we go. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about Marzano's influence on the questions. Now, how many of you are sort of familiar with this? Anybody? Okay, so I'll kind of review it. But basically, and the book, by the way, is on my website. I've got the actual book that I took it from, written a couple years ago. But it's a book on formative assessment. And Marzano's like the guru of formative assessment. He came to Spring Arbor, I think it was in spring of 2010, just about the time I was hatching this whole thing. So that was he's a pretty nice guy too. He's very good looking too, which is really nice. Anyway, well, some guys you look at them like but not him. So he talks about in particular levels 2, 3, and 4. So a level 2 question would be something that gets at basic understanding. What I would call the takeaway, the thing that you want them to remember, or the thing if they you died of a heart attack, what's the one thing they'd remember about the content as the last thing? So it's something that most students can answer without help. And if you want to put it in terms of a grade, it would be the C to B minus student would be able to answer level 2 questions. Okay. So as an example, this is one of the examples from our class. So we've got, and they've already had this lecture about the binomial nomenclature, and an example of that would be Homo sapiens. That's what we're called, people in the nomenclature, and Homo would be the genus, and species would be sapiens. So what I'm doing is I'm looking to see if they know the answer, basically. Okay. So this would be an example of a level 2 question. So then let's look at level 3. Now level 3 would be for the student that you would say has complete understanding of the material. This would be the targeted level that you want. Okay. So if you have students that can answer level 2 but can't answer level 3, one of your interventions would be to figure out how to get them there. Now you might have students that can't answer level 2. Obviously that's more like a 911 call, okay, if they can't get the level 2. But the level 3 is what the majority of your curriculum is supposed to do. Probably a lot of us would assume that a student would be, students, especially if they've seen some of this material in the distant past, they probably can handle the level 2s generally, but the level 3s are the ones that they really need work on. So I'd say most of our curricular efforts, most of our teaching efforts is in between level 2 and level 3 to move them up to that. So again, level 3 would be the B to A minus student should be able to get those level 3 questions. Okay. So again, in the context of my science class, this would be an example of a level 3 question. Okay. So we've talked about all the different kingdoms, and we've talked about some of the aspects of the kingdoms. And now what I want to do is I want to see if they understand the difference between this one particular kingdom, Monera, if you guys know anything about life science, and the other kingdoms. Okay, there are just basically a couple of differences that you can get to that are kind of at a general abstracted level. And prokaryotic cells is probably the main difference between those two. So again, looking to see if students have understood this or not. Now again, this is ungraded, so they haven't taken a test on this. They haven't had anything at all other than the lecture presented. So then what I want to do is be able to look and see did they get it. If they didn't, then I probably need to cover this again. Okay. Now, the last one is level 4. Okay. And that is what Marzano would say, the ability to go beyond what is presented. So you talk about something in the classroom, they go beyond that. Okay? They synthesize, if you're into Bloom's taxonomy, or they're creative, but they're operating up at that level. And so if you're looking for level 4 understanding, this is where the multiple choice questions get a little tricky, because this is really where you'd want to have an open-ended question to kind of let them cut loose. But because of my choice earlier with using the Turing software and the Turing technologies and the simple clickers, I'm using multiple choice. So basically what I have to do is I have to create an analogy and then see if they can identify the analogy. Or I have to do, I'm thinking of Sesame Street, one of these things is or is not like the other. And I have to do that kind of question. Okay? And you probably, basically if you're finding yourself writing one of those questions at level 3, you probably should stop and say, no, level 3 I'm really still getting a complete understanding, but I'm not getting to analogies or the one of these things is or is not like the other until I want to see if they can go beyond. So sometimes for level 4, I'll try to say, I'm not even going to try to use words I've even used when I talk to the students and see if they can bridge the gap. And it could be they're just geniuses. It could be they've had additional exploration on their own with their parents. Maybe they came to talk to me after class and we had a private discussion with a student or a few students. It doesn't matter to me how they got the information, but somehow I'm seeing that they're able to make that connection beyond where I'd expect most students. This would be the A student. Okay, so in Marzano's level, the A student shows you they can go beyond what you've talked about. The A minus to B shows they can, I'll use the R word, regurgitate what you presented. And then the C to B minus student is the one that, without help, can at least get the big idea. Okay? And then as an example of the level 4 question, up there I go, I hit the keyboard thing. That's where I got it. That's where the fingernail comes in handy. this would be an example of a level 4 question. Okay, so I did talk about a general definition of an open circulatory system, but I never tied it to any of those. And you see that there are some answers in there that are kind of bigger than just a person, and then there are, or rather an entity of some kind, and then there are things that are smaller than that. So then the question is, can they figure out what is really the most similar to that? So again, I didn't use any of these words. I never tied any of this stuff together, and I wouldn't expect most of the students to get this. But if some do, I'm thinking, okay, these should be the students that are really getting the material that are going to be able to synthesize. Okay, so I feel like, especially after a couple years of doing this, that scheme works really well for figuring out how to write these clicker questions. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, fingernail. Okay, so now let's get on to the interpretation part of this. Okay, the interpretation is how I was able to make sense of the data that I got. Okay, so what I did is, let's see, let me just make sure I'm doing TriMath. Good. So what I did is I had two classes. In the fall of 2010, I had one group of about 21 students, and then in fall 2011, I had another group of 23 students, and nobody flunked, so I had two completely different groups. In 2010, I team taught the class, so I was able to just work with about half the semester's worth of information, and then I turned it over to the other instructor. In 2011, I taught the class completely by myself, so in 2011, it's presenting the entire semester worth of stuff. 2010, well, actually in both semesters, I did something similar, and that is there was part of the class where they had to do something to show some kind of a discrepant scientific phenomenon. I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Spangler science, if you've seen any of that. If you are, he does these little, or he or his crew do these 1 to 3 minute demonstrations of something, what I call discrepant. It's like, how does that work? I don't get it. Or wow, that's really cool. What happened? Those kinds of things. So I asked the students, because in this class it's content, so I'm trying to get them to really think like scientists and think like, and also think like a teacher, clearly. So I'm putting them in a position to say, okay, you're going to do this experiment. Well, really it's a demonstration more than an experiment. And then you're going to see if you can help figure out if the students know what's going on. So for both classes, part of this is the students did these demonstrations, and they did them in groups of about 3. And then they also designed the questions, and I talked to them about the 3 Marzano levels, just like I've talked to you about, gave them the same little excerpt that is on the website. And then they wrote the questions. Now, for this part of the assignment, I did not grade how well they wrote the questions, because what I was trying to do is just get them out of the shell and out there being able to be in front of the class and doing stuff. So I'm going to refer to those later on. When you see a reference to a student or student questions or student clicker, that's what that is. And then there's the other part of where I used the clickers for the stuff I was talking about, and that you'll see that called instructor clicker or instructor whatever. And then when you see overall means it's a combination of both. So I'm just throwing everything together and seeing how the response is, whether it was from a student or from my question. Okay. So again, I did those both semesters. The philosophy was a little different. In 2010, everything was explained. So whether it was the students or myself, they would always remember explained is you put the explanations in between the questions. Okay. In 2011, I had the students go straight. So that means they presented the questions, boom, 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 and then explained afterwards, while I continued to put the explanations in between the questions. And that influences kind of how the results, which is kind of fun to watch. Okay? So that's the difference between explained and straight. So let's take a look at what we got. Now this is not from the software at all. The stuff I showed you before was an example of the results you get from the Turning software. This is from the program that I used to analyze it. This particular program is called the SPSS. It's a pretty big time statistical program, but you can do these same sorts of calculations with Excel. Or if you ever just look online and you want to get something that calculates means, minimums, maximums, and correlations, there's lots of programs that do, but Excel will handle this stuff too. Excuse me. Okay, let's see if I can do some annotation here. So So you've got the M2 and M3, okay? That's what I'm looking at right there. That's the overall. This is for 2010, okay? Then let's look at this right here, okay? And then finally we'll look at this right here. Okay, so this is the 2010 group. This is the group where both the students and I put the explanations in between. Now, ideally, if the M2s were the C to B minus students and the M3, that's M is Marzano level 2, Marzano level 3, Marzano level 4. So I should see a progression. This should be the highest mean, and this should be a little lower because I'm just getting the B to A minus students, and this should be the A students. But you notice that it follows a similar pattern. And the reason is that we were interjecting the explanations. And so what happened is you might get the initial cut here, but then when you start to explain what's going on, it sort of solidifies what's happening in their minds a little better. So when you ask that tougher, really, truly a tougher question, you've already stimulated their thinking about the subject. Maybe even if they had an intuition or had a sense but weren't quite on, so you've kind of corrected them by giving that explanation, and now they're able to lock in. So the level 3 turned out to really work out really well and had a higher score, and then it dropped again for the level 4. Okay? So that's one of the reasons if you go ahead and put the explanations in between the questions, don't be surprised if you see something like that. Okay? And then I'll show you later data where we didn't do that. Okay. Going out of annotation mode. See, I go out of annotation mode and all the little circles go away. Yeah, like I said, air sketch, huh? I'll give that a look. This is the 2011 data. Okay, so again, if you look at, and this time I'm just going to look at me. Oops, I forgot to go into annotation mode. Sorry. Annotation mode. There we go. Oh, and I get my circles back. Whoa, heck, they're almost in the right place too. So now, if you notice, in 2011, the students asked their questions straight with no explanations in between. And now you get the behavior you would expect, where the level 2 question had a higher mean, level 3 was lower, level 4 was lower. So again, you should expect to see that if you ask the question just straight and then come in with explanation on the back end. I, on the other hand, continued because my preference is usually to present it with the explanations embedded between. So I had the same phenomenon that you saw before. Okay, so again, depending on how you use this thing, you'll see both. Which and nothing wrong with either one, but they're both good. Okay, I hit an erase button and they all go away and go out of annotation mode. So far so good. I was hoping this thing wouldn't croak. Okay, now let's get to the second one down there. Okay, and that is something called indices of difficulty and discrimination. Anybody ever heard of those before? Just out of curiosity. This is something I discovered, I think it was 2 years ago, either 2 or 3 years ago at MACUL, when somebody was talking about the turning software, and I didn't realize that this was a feature in the turning software. But what it will do is it will generate these two numbers, and one of them is called the difficulty index, and the other is called the discrimination index. And this is going to be true for a set of questions. So this won't be as meaningful if you just have one question by itself. But if you have 2, 3, 4, or a larger set of questions that you ask, okay, my standard number is 3 when I do this. The difficulty index will tell you basically the number of students that got it right. That's what it's kind of keyed to. The number itself, the difficulty index number, will be a number between 0 and 1. And if you had a 1, that would mean everybody got it right. If you had a 0, it would mean nobody got it right. And generally speaking, if your difficulty index is about 0.75 or higher, that's probably considered an easy question. And if your index is down like 0.25 or lower, you probably would consider that a hard question. Okay? So it's kind of an easy way to take a look at your questions and say, gosh, maybe that was too hard a question, and based on the number of students. The other one that's even more interesting is the discrimination, the second one. What that says is, and that's the discrimination, by the way, is why you really want to have groups of questions when you do this sort of analysis. But the discrimination says, okay, did the high-performing students on, let's say it's 3 questions, and I'm looking at question 1. Did the high-performing students on questions 2 and 3 also perform high on question 1? If they did, then that number will be closer to 1. if there didn't seem to be any correlation between them, it seemed to be fairly random. You know, some students did well on 2 and 3, but did poorly here, and vice versa. Then your number will be closer to 0, okay, which means there's not really a lot of discrimination. So it almost looks, it's not really random, but it almost could look random. But this one can also go negative, and if this one goes down to -1, that means the opposite's happening. Somehow the students that have done well on the other problems are missing this one, and the students that didn't do so well on the other problems are getting this like crazy. And usually if I hit that something in the negative range, that's when I start to think, wow, I must have worded this really badly, or I must have somehow confused my bright students. And who wants to do that, right? So I want to go back, and I'd say if that discrimination number ever goes negative, you definitely want to say, ouch, I need to fix that. Something happened. You probably can tell. You'll see the confused looks right away. So let me give you some examples. This is stuff I already showed you. Okay, so I already showed you my level 2, level 3, and level 4. Let's go back and look. And what happens is, and on the turning software, there's when you run the report, you can ask for difficulty and discrimination, and it'll just spit this right out, just like this. Okay, so you can see on that particular question. Now these are 3 questions that were together. On that particular question, the difficulty was 0.58. Okay, so I would rather have seen that a little higher. Okay, so one of my questions to myself is, I wonder if I can do something with that question or with that knowledge to get this up. So this is more like, 0.58 is not bad, but I'd rather see that for a level 2 question be up in the 0.7, 0.8 range. Okay, the discrimination index is really good. Okay, this is saying that on this particular question, the high-performing students on the other questions were getting this one too. So it's telling me really discriminating between the high and low performing. Now, if we look at the level 3 question, okay, again, looking at that same information, you can see the difficulty. That's a little more, probably not a bad spot for level 3. Maybe 0.5, but this is pretty close. So I'm in the right ballpark with this question for level 3. And for discrimination, I'm doing okay with 0.5. Usually, again, if you're above 0.3 on discrimination, you're probably okay. And you definitely never want to be negative. Okay. Now let's look at the level 4 one. On the level 4 one, that's probably where I want the difficulty for level 4. I do want a hard question. 0.25 is about the threshold for hard. So I like that one right there. And again, my discrimination is good. It's 0.5. Okay, I can take that. So again, when you use the turning software, and I can't speak to other ones, but on the turning software, this comes out right out of the reports you run. So I would say if you're not using turning, try to see if you have difficulty in discrimination. Now you can't calculate this, but it's kind of a pain to do it. So see if it's in the software. If not, I would say talk to your sales rep or whoever is the clicker guru at your school and ask them, how can I get difficulty in discrimination? Because this is probably one of the best tools to really have you look at your question and say, am I asking a good question here? Okay. By the way, not all my questions work out this way. I picked this to illustrate. Some of my questions, are not as good, and I need to go back and make adjustments. That's also a fact of life too. So don't feel like every single question I ask always hits the mark just like that. It doesn't. Okay, that was the easier part of the interpretation. Let's get over to the more difficult part. And these things, probably you'll have to use something other than the software for the clickers. Okay, like again, I used SPSS, and the reason I use SPSS is it produces tables and graphs really nicely and easily, but you could do the same stuff with Excel or numbers or any online spreadsheeting program. If it handles correlations and handles scatter plots, then you can do it. So with a correlation, what I'm looking for is a high score on one scale going to kind of equate to a high score on the other scale. In other words, if the students are getting the clicker questions right, and I look at their performance on the clicker questions, which are ungraded, and they seem to be doing well on that, does that also mean that those students tend to get the better grades, the higher test grades, or the higher exam grades, however you're assessing them? Are both of those, and vice versa, if the students are not doing so well on the clicker stuff, they're getting lower scores, I'm also seeing lower scores on the test. If that's happening, then this is working the way it's supposed to, and then I can do some intervention. If it's not happening, then I'm in trouble. I need to rethink some stuff. Maybe you need to go back and look at those questions and decide, wow, maybe I need to rephrase that. So on the correlations, the range is going to be from 0 to 1 on correlations, And there's it spits out this value called r squared. I won't bore you with the details, but if r squared is significant, and this particular software will say that or not, then you're better off. Okay, for these kinds of things, there's not really a golden rule for what the number should be, but I would say if you're getting above 0.3, you're doing okay. If I was hard science and we were doing experiments with radiation or something, if you didn't hit 0.8, I'd say do it over. Okay, so this is an example of the correlation table. Okay, now this is the software I used, but what I'm looking at is this is the overall clicker I told you just before. Here's the instructor. Okay, so just my questions, and these just the student questions. Okay, one of the things I'm looking for is the first thing I want to see is the grade correlated. Okay, so I'm going to look at this column right here. So that's kind of the critical information. So let's see, go into annotation mode here. Okay, so that's the key column right there. And what this is telling me right there, that's telling me that I can use how they're performing on the clickers to correlate their grade to it. That's what I was hoping to see. And furthermore, I can see that when I do mine, it's still correlated. That's what the two little asterisks are saying is that there is definitely a relationship. But when I looked at how the students did, there's not quite that relationship. That's not the end of the world. That's not a bad thing, because what you really need to do is look at the data itself and see how it looks, which we'll get to that in just a second. So if you're looking at correlations, that's what you're hoping to see, is that there's a good correlation with how you write your questions and what their grades are. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to erase that and go out of annotation mode and go back to the scatter plot and regression. Now with the scatter plot and regression, a scatter plot is just a regular XY plot. Okay, so all you're doing is you would plot your data with the clicker on the x-axis, which is the bottom axis down here. Okay, and then you have the grade or the test or whatever it is that your other means of assessment on the y-axis. And you would just look at the data. There's no real math analysis here. You just want to see, is it kind of a straight line? And ideally, you'd want there to be a kind of a trend where the points go like that. Okay, they could go like that. You definitely don't want them to go like that. If they go like that, then you've got an inverse correlation and probably not working out so well. I'll show you an example. Oops, if I get my pinky on there. There's an example. Okay, so this is the overall data from one of the years, and there's the grade, and you can see now what that line is that's called a regression line. It's, again, statistical packages, Excel. We'll just generate it if you just ask for it. It'll stick it in there, and that's what I did for this. And but just by looking at it, what I'm seeing is, okay, good. This is what I'm hoping to see in terms of prediction. This is working out nicely. The clickers are predicting the grades pretty well. Okay. So again, this is the more difficult analysis for what you're doing. But when you get to this point, now you can say, okay, my joy is complete. If I can count on the clickers to predict the grade, then I can look at their scores, and if students are not doing so well, I can do some kind of intervention to help them. Okay. Okay, so now finally I'm going to talk about my experience. So first of all, there's the monkey see, monkey do phenomenon. Okay, and I actually showed you this before. Okay, and that is when I did the, nope, I did it again. Sorry, get that back in there. I always forget to hit the annotation tool. There we go. So when I did mine, okay, and I did the explanations in between the questions, the students did it, and they did the same thing, and that's what we got. So again, because we kind of stimulated their thinking after that level 2 question, they seemed to get better with the level 3, and then they came back down to on the level 4. Okay, so again, that's the monkey see, monkey do phenomenon. And in contrast to that, this is, again, I showed this to you before. This is the other set of data where when you put you have them just go straight through, it drops, the mean drops. Okay. The second thing I found out is you have to think about students who don't turn anything in. And what I'm really thinking of is a lot of times you have a grade, and the grade is based on they have to turn something in. And if they don't turn it in, oftentimes they just miss that. They might get a 0 or something like that. I try to be as graceful as possible, or gracious as possible, and giving them time to turn something in, but sometimes they just don't get to it. So one of the times, what I did is I plotted the relationship, but if you notice, I've got what I will call these two outliers down here. Okay? So I said, okay, what's up with those two? Because they're getting good scores on the clicker questions, but they didn't get such a high grade. And so what I did is I went and looked, I kind of knew anyway, but I went back and double checked, and sure enough, the reason they were a little low on the grade is because they didn't turn in some work. Okay? So what do you do when that happens? Well, what I would suggest is, this is going to sound funny, this is an analysis. It's not like you're flunking them out of school. Just remove them from the analysis. So you do that, and suddenly it's looking a lot better. So I'm going to show you that. Notice those 2 points down there. Okay, we'll go to that same thing with the 2 points removed, and you see they're gone. Those 2 points down here are gone, and things line up a lot better. So again, if that happens, that's why it's important to look at your data and to kind of understand if something doesn't seem to be working right. Why? Because that's obviously, if students don't turn work in and they end up getting a bad grade because they didn't turn work in, then some of this isn't going to work out. You've got those students, so do I. Okay. So the next thing I learned is that when I talked before about explaining after level 2, it improves the level 3. And that has its strengths and weaknesses. It's good because I think the students are learning better. Here's 3 graphs, and the left one is the level 2 question, the middle one's the level 3, and the last one's the level 4. And you can see the level 3 one is looking good. This is one of the times when I did the explanation in between the questions. Okay? So I would say if you're going to do that and you're going to explain in between the questions, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but you're probably going to be looking at your level 3 as the major predictor in that case. So you look at how they do on the level 3 question and say, that's what I'm going to pin to my interventions on, and not the overall performance on the clickers. Just like that, you can see it correlates a lot better, the middle one, than the other two. So that would be my advice. And again, that's a pedagogical decision. You know, you might, like I said, well, I'll get to that in a second. That's my preferred way to do it, is to explain in between the questions. But if I do that, I won't see quite what I want to see sometimes. Then, of course, there's the difference between the straight up and the explanations. Okay, and I talked a bit about that already. You can see here, when I did the explanations, I got that same little increase in the middle. When the students did it straight up, they did it, and they got the score. They got the score declining straight in. So that's something, if depending on what decision you make, you're going to see that. And then the last thing, when you allow for mastery learning, now I'm getting to some of the 2011 stuff, the data will get funny. So this is the 2011 correlation. Now, what you see here is, again, a couple of oddities. You see this one student that seemed to be fairly disengaged from the clickers and ended up getting a lousy grade. Okay. And this is not a problem with not turning in stuff. This was just not performing well. But if you just go straight up here, almost right on top of where they were with the clickers, you see these other two students that got really high grades, that on the clickers they were doing just about as well. This is the opposite end of the spectrum from the two students I talked about before. Before I talked about the students that don't turn stuff in. These are the students that work their tails off. Okay? This is not a bad thing if you see this. You would look at that R-squared number and think, gee, that's not very high. There's not a great correlation. But in a sense, this is a type of success because these are students that when they were asked the questions, they didn't get it. But by the time they actually took the test, the quiz, whatever the assessment was, they got it. And again, combination, intervention on your part, them pursuing something on their own, trying to find out more, maybe working with a partner. Maybe they had that after class, I don't get it, can you explain this to me again discussion? I know for sure the top one of those two is definitely the come in as soon as the class is over, hey, I didn't understand this. So, if you see that, then understand that the data may not look so good, but there's a reason for that. And again, that's the whole, if you're into mastery learning and you let students turn things in take a second shot at something, you're probably going to see the same trend where on the clicker questions, they're not going to perform so well, but their grade's going to look pretty good because they got another chance at it. Okay? So again, that's why I think it's really important to be able to look at your data like in a way like this and just look at it and think about it without doing all the numbers, worrying about the numbers so much. So I came up with my own level 2, level 3, and level 4. So this is pretty much the takeaway for you. What it is for me, I'm going to call it a hypothesis or a prediction because I'm going to be doing a little more in-depth study on this starting next fall, trying to formalize this a little better. This basically has been a pilot study for the last 2 years. But it's also advice. It's advice to myself. It's advice to you. And that is, here's the level 2 version of it. Okay? If you're going to use the clickers, my advice would be don't grade the clicker responses. Okay? Let it stay ungraded. Just make sure, again, don't put goofy options, and they'll take it seriously. Do it straight. In other words, present the questions, and then come back at the end and talk about the content. But don't put the content in between. And then, like I said, go straight and explain later. If you just check the means, how they're doing on the level 2, level 3, and level 4, which is the easier stuff I talked about, and those discrimination and difficulty indices, and check them weekly, then you can intervene with confidence. Okay? Because as you know, there are some students that don't say that they're not getting it. They just are there, and they look like they could be taking notes, but they just don't seem to be there. So this is the way you can go on the weekend or Friday or whenever your free time is. And it would take probably 5 minutes to just look over how the class is doing. Especially if you build this thing from the beginning, then just adding to the data every week, and it's really not hard to do at all. It takes literally 5 minutes to take the data from a week and put it into whatever it is you're doing to chart their progress. But then you can look and you can see how they're doing and say, okay, I'm confident now that this student is not getting it, and it's probably not because they're blowing it off. They're really having a difficult time understanding, and so I'm going to do something to intervene. And then you can track their progress after that. But the beauty of it, I think, is that it's ungraded. Okay? I think that's the key. You keep your assessments, your summative assessment, your grade, different from your formative assessment, which is what you're doing with the clickers. Now the level 3 understanding for this would be if you get into the correlations and the plots. That's the interpretation that I said was the harder interpretation. But if you can figure out how to work with that, and I'll make the Rubio guarantee like I do with my students, and that is if you start getting to try some of this and you get into some, I'm not quite sure what to do next, even if you're using a different system than turning, I'll be happy to work with you. Okay, so you just send me an email and I'll do it. So you get the Rubio guarantee even if you're not a Spring Arbor student. And then the level 4, if you go beyond, then you'll hopefully tell me and inform me, because I'm just getting, I've only done this for a couple years, and I'm not going to have, some of you that teach in high school are teaching way more students than I am every day. So you're going to get a lot better at this a lot quicker than I will probably. So if you find yourself doing more of this and you find some things that are working, please let me know, and I'll not only study it with you, but I'll pass it along to other people I know as well. So that's pretty much it. Again, if you need to see the Prezi, you can go to the MACUL, or you can just hit that directly, and then there it is. So just wondering, any questions? I often tell my students I have this amazing ability to just talk so thoroughly that I cover everything so well, nobody ever has questions. Thank you again for coming out here on a Friday afternoon. I hope you win something at the keynote.